Good evening and welcome to the latest and last lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum's Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker. Or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and go to about 9 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a YouTube channel. As I mentioned, this talk is being recorded and will be posted shortly after it concludes. To access the channel, please see the icon at the top of the website. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at wwiidf.org. Now, this evening's speaker and someone I'm really thrilled to have, Mark Van Ells is a professor of history at Queensborough Community College of the City University of New York. He received his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a native of the Badger State. Mark is the author of To Hear Only Thunder Again, America's World War II Veterans Come Home, and America in World War I, A Traveler's Guide. His website is markdvanells.com. This evening, he's going to discuss his book, Red Arrow Across the Pacific, the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II, which reveals the long overdue story of the renowned 32nd Red Arrow Infantry Division. Not surprisingly, the reviews are top shelf with Captain Florian Wadel, who is the command historian for the Wisconsin Army National Guard, concluding the book is exceptionally well researched and engagingly written. It's a must read for any student of military history. While Mary Louise Roberts, who is the professor emerita of history at the University of Wisconsin and the author of Sheer Misery, Soldiers in Battle in World War II, writes, it's a superb divisional history, highly recommended for a general audience as well as readers interested in the Second World War. I would conclude with both those reviews. It's a fantastic book, and the amount of research that's gone into it is really staggering. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark.
Thank you very much for having me on this very last program of 2025. I appreciate it. So my talk tonight is about the 32nd Infantry Division during the Second World War, a division that had a remarkable record during the Second World War, and yet one that oftentimes doesn't come to mind when people think about the most famous American fighting units of the Second World War, like the 1st Marine Division or the 101st Airborne Division. But the 32nd Division had a very long record during the Second World War. Let me start by talking about the background to the Red Arrow Division. It was created during the First World War when the United States entered that conflict. In 1917, it was made up of National Guard units from Wisconsin and Michigan. It trained at Camp MacArthur, Texas, was shipped to France, and during the First World War, the 32nd Division had amassed a pretty impressive combat record during the war. From the Aisne-Marne offensive during the summer of 1917 at Soissons, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, culminating at the culmination of the First World War, every time the 32nd Division went into battle, it pierced a German line. It always advanced, it always won. And so at the end of the war, when American divisions were developing their emblems and their shoulder patches, the 32nd Division developed the emblem that you see here, a red arrow pointing upward, passing through a horizontal bar. This was meant to symbolize the fact that the division had in fact penetrated every German line. So it had a good reputation during the First World War. It was the National Guard division during the 1920s and 1930s. Oftentimes funding was not adequate for the division. But then World War II came. The American mobilization for World War II really began in the fall of 1940. The 32nd Division was called up in October of 1940. It was sent to Louisiana for training, first at Fort Beauregard, then at Camp Livingston, Louisiana. Both were near the city of Alexandria. That's where many National Guard soldiers who were not particularly well trained between the wars really learned to be soldiers. The division began to absorb draftees, and it began to become a more professional military unit. It took part in the famous Louisiana maneuvers during the summer of 1941, the single largest military maneuvers ever in American history. Something like 400,000 soldiers played war games across Louisiana that summer. The 32nd Division was involved in that. And the 32nd Division was still in Louisiana when Pearl Harbor happened, December 7th of 1941. So that's where the division was when America actually formally entered the war. And very shortly after Pearl Harbor, the division was on the move. And in fact, it had quite an odyssey during 1942. The Red Arrow was originally scheduled to go to Europe. It was transferred from Louisiana to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where it prepared for overseas embarkation. But the situation in the Pacific was deteriorating in early 1942. The Americans were barely hanging on in the Philippines. Australia was under threat. Australia needed some help. And so Washington redirected the 32nd Division to the Pacific. Now, already it had moved from Louisiana up to Massachusetts. Now it had to do a cross-country rail trip to San Francisco. At San Francisco, it boarded ships and it headed across the ocean to Australia. Landed at Port Adelaide in May of 1942. In mid-1942, it moved a bit northward to Camp Cable in Queensland, Australia, and here's where the division began to train for war. Although it was perhaps not the kind of training that would prepare the division for jungle combat, something that very few American units had any experience with anyway. The 32nd Division had been trained for Europe with the expectation of fighting the Germans. And while training in Louisiana, its training regimen hadn't really changed all that much. It really didn't concentrate on things like night operations or camouflage and concealment and some of the things that might have been good for training in a jungle environment. It was pretty much the same kind of training it had had before. It focused a lot on conditioning, but the same basic kind of training it had in Louisiana. Here's the Allied leadership team as the 32nd Division was preparing to actually go into battle. This was part of something called the Southwest Pacific Area. Commanding SWAPA, as it was known, was General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most famous and controversial American generals during the Second World War. An Australian, Sir Thomas Blamey, was commander of Allied land forces for SWAPA. Blamey was one of the very few Australians that MacArthur put on his high-ranking staff. Commanding the First Corps, or I Corps, for the United States was General Robert Eichelberger. The 32nd Division was a part of the First Corps, and commanding the 32nd Division was General Edwin Forrest Harding, who was known as a very nice guy. He was a scholar of military history, although some questioned his toughness to command a division in combat, and were not always happy with the way he trained the 32nd Division to prepare it for combat. But on the eve of combat, here we're talking mid 1942, the 32nd Division was very confident, but it was also inexperienced. And I think that's probably true of American military forces in general during the Second World War. The 32nd Division in particular, it was very proud of its World War I heritage. Um, and they fully expected that in the Second World War, they would defeat the Japanese without too much difficulty. But as I noted before, the training was inadequate. The equipment was inadequate. The division did not even have jungle fatigues or jungle boots or anything like this. Um, and as I noted also before, the division was constantly on the move across the United States, across the Pacific Ocean. Then it moved to various stations in Australia. It had not, since Pearl Harbor, it had not been in one place for any more than a couple of months. And this certainly interrupted the division's training. The division also had questionable leadership. Top brass, like MacArthur and his staff, and this is true across the Army, they were often very, very suspicious of National Guard units and National Guard soldiers. And the officers in particular, they viewed the National Guard as largely being too old to fight, as being um, untrained, um, maybe not ready to lead soldiers in combat. And also, many were, for military purposes, quite old as well, like in their 30s and 40s. In fact, the Army had removed many National Guard officers, but replaced them with many reservists whose experience was also quite questionable. People who have looked at military history have certainly heard the term 90-day wonder before. So it's questionable as to whether replacing National Guard officers with reservists was really much of an upgrade at all. I think you can also, when you talk about questionable leadership, think about General MacArthur as well, who was oftentimes very brilliant, but also known to be very egotistical and difficult to work with, and someone who craved publicity. And so his leadership, particularly during this period, can be called into question as well. His defense of the Philippines raised many questions, and now MacArthur was charged with defending Australia and beginning to push the Japanese back across the Pacific. Um, the division also suffered from poor intelligence. Basically, the American, I should say Allied forces really didn't have any clue how many Japanese they were about to face, consistently underestimated the fighting quality of Japanese soldiers, consistently underestimated the number of Japanese soldiers that they were about to face. They really didn't have much of an idea of what they were up against. And finally, I should note that the SWAPA had very little support from the Navy. The Navy, of course, was fighting its own battle at Guadalcanal at this time. That commenced in August of 1942. The Navy had its hands full, the Navy and Marines, I should point out, and the Navy was not particularly crazy about turning over many of its ships to an Army General MacArthur either. There was a lot of inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy. And so the 32nd Division would not receive a lot of naval support in its first combat operation. And that first combat operation came in New Guinea. a large island to the north of Australia, in particular on the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea. This is the far eastern end of the island. So here's a map. Let's look at the situation. In July of 1942, Japanese forces invaded the northern shore of Papua at a place called Buna. And then they began to press inland from Buna across the rugged jungles and mountains of New Guinea, across the Owen Stanley Range, which in some places reaches as high as the Rocky Mountains in the American West. And they began to push across the interior of New Guinea, heading for the Australian-held port of Port Moresby. This was the Australian administrative center for New Guinea. And in fact, the Japanese were getting rather close, within 30 miles or so of Port Moresby. So it looked like the Australians' allied situation in New Guinea was very precarious now as we get into August and September of 1942. And the 32nd Division is selected to go to New Guinea to bolster the Australians. The first elements arrive in September of 1942, and they arrive by plane. And this is the first time in American military history that soldiers had been flown into a combat zone. The 128th Infantry Division, that division flew to New Guinea as well. The 126th Infantry Division of the Red Arrow, it went by boat. The 127th Infantry Regiment, it stayed behind in Australia as a reserve. But these were the first Red Arrow soldiers to reach New Guinea. Now, the question was, how do these soldiers get across the Owen Stanley Range to take on the Japanese on the north side of the island? In October of 1942, a battalion of the 126th Infantry Regiment went overland, over a trail, a track that Americans knew as the Kappa Kappa track. The Americans were just as ignorant as the Japanese were about the conditions in New Guinea, the geography of New Guinea, and this battalion made it across the mountains, but it was in a much weakened state. And so an overland route for the Americans was not going to work. The Australians were pushing the Japanese back across the Kokoda track, but the Americans had to find a way to get to the north side of the island. Here, once again, aircraft came to the rescue. The Americans and Australians had established some airfields on the northern shore of New Guinea, and so the rest of the division was flown to the north side to meet the Japanese. And New Guinea was unlike any place these American soldiers of the 32nd Division had ever experienced before. New Guinea, as I noted before, was covered with lush jungle and mountains. Now, many Red Arrow soldiers were experienced hunters and outdoorsmen, but they had never seen an environment quite like this before. Very, very dense jungle, high temperatures, 90 degrees during the daytime, extremely humid, a land not only covered with jungle, but swamps, very high mountains, and mosquitoes, malaria in particular, would take a very, very heavy toll on the Red Arrow Division. And New Guinea was an island with almost no infrastructure, no roadways, no railways that you might find in Europe. The only way through the island and around the island was by water, or by overland tracks, trails through the mountains and jungles, which made it very difficult to move things from one place to another. The Papuan campaign was, in fact, a logistical nightmare. How do you move troops across this region without modern infrastructure? Well, the Allies would have to build it, build ports along the north shore of the island, and without much naval support. So it was very difficult to move troops, supplies, and heavy weapons like artillery, tanks at first were not able to get to the North Shore, at least not in very large numbers. Very little artillery, no tanks early in the campaign at all. So it was a logistical nightmare. I should note that the Papua New Guinean population was exceptionally important for the Allied conduct of this battle. Papua was administered by Australia. Um, the Papua New Guinean population had largely been used for labor on plantations before the war, and the Australian government had mobilized the Papua New Guinean population for the war. Papua New Guineans served as guides. They were oftentimes the ones who did the back-breaking work of transporting goods from one place to another. As you see in the photograph here, Papua New Guineans were also very important for evacuating wounded soldiers. So the Allied war effort really probably would not have succeeded without the local population engaged and participating in the campaign. So here's what the situation looks like now by November of 1942. As I noted before, the Australians had been pushing the Japanese back over the Kokoda Track. The 32nd Division was coming in along the coastline from the east, and they're beginning to converge on the Japanese positions on the north coast. And the Japanese were located in three different pockets along the north coast. On the far west was a pocket called Gona, the smallest of the three. In the center was the Sanananda pocket, which was the largest of the three, and where the Japanese had their headquarters. And on the far east was a pocket around the village of Buna. Now, the Australians would be responsible for Gona. The Australians would also be responsible for reducing the Sanananda pocket, although there was a battalion of the 126th Regiment, 32nd Division, that fought with the Australians here. But it would be General Harding and the 32nd's job to reduce the pocket at Buna. And you see the map on the right. That's a close-up of the Buna pocket. On the far east was a large plantation called the Duropa Plantation. On the far west was Buna Village. Located not too far from Buna Village was a location called Buna Government Center, which Americans incorrectly but consistently referred to as Buna Mission. And these areas were very heavily defended by the Japanese. Rivers and streams the Japanese used to great effect. On the plantation, the Japanese had constructed lots of bunkers, and everywhere in between was covered with swamps that made it very, very difficult to operate in. Now, again, the Allies did not know how many Japanese they were facing at Buna. They thought maybe 2,000 troops. In fact, the Japanese had more than 6,000 soldiers at Buna. And many of them were experienced combat soldiers, unlike the 32nd Division, which in fact was inexperienced. It was green in combat. But the 32nd Division went into the fight with great confidence. And this baptism of fire, this first combat of the division, was quite traumatic. Now, that's true for every soldier and every fighting unit in every war, but I think it's probably fair to say that for the 32nd Division, it was more traumatic than usual. The first attack occurred on the east at the Doropa plantation. This was an area that the Allies called the Warren Front. This occurred on November the 19th. American soldiers advanced, not knowing what to expect, and then they were hit with very heavy Japanese fire from countless bunkers across the plantation, and the Red Arrow soldiers were pretty much stopped cold. On November 21st, the Red Arrow soldiers began to advance in the west towards Buna Village and Buna Mission. This was known as the Urbana Front, and this too was a slap in the face, and they made very few advances. Japanese soldiers had constructed brilliant defenses, heavily camouflaged bunkers like the one you see here, which American soldiers had not really been trained to search for, had no experience in trying to reduce fortifications like this. And you can see on this photograph here how well camouflaged these bunkers were. If you look carefully, you can see an American soldier in there. And the Red Arrow Division had not trained for this, was not anticipating anything like this, and the division made very slow progress at first. Progress that was so slow that General MacArthur was growing very, very impatient with the 32nd Division at Buna. General MacArthur sometimes did not have nice things to say about Australian soldiers. But now it was American soldiers who weren't advancing fast enough, and MacArthur developed a grudge against the 32nd Division. He wanted General Harding relieved. He sent Eichelberger, the I Corps commander, to go to Buna and take command there. And MacArthur's famous words to Eichelberger, as he was about to depart for Buna, he said, "Take Buna or don't come back alive," which I suppose one can view as a message of resolve. One might also view this as a message that suggests he wasn't particularly concerned about casualties. Whatever the case, Eichelberger went to Buna, and at first he was not able to punch through the Japanese defenses either. Very little changed for the first few days of Eichelberger's command. But by early December, things in fact start to turn around for the Red Arrow Division. They, in fact, gained experience. It was a steep learning curve. They paid a very heavy price for this combat experience, but they began to understand how to knock out a bunker, how to operate in a jungle environment. I might also add that there were a few members of the Red Arrow Division who, in fact, did have combat experience. One of the most interesting characters in the 32nd Division during World War II was someone named Hermann Bottcher, who was German. He was born in Germany. He was an immigrant to the United States. He was involved in Germany's communist movement during the 1920s before he left Germany. He volunteered to fight for the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, returned to the United States after the Spanish Civil War, and enlisted in the U.S. Army. wanting to continue his fight against fascism. He was assigned to the 32nd Division, and on December the 5th of 1942, Botcher led an American attack through Japanese lines to the coastline. He basically separated Buna Village from Buna Mission. And this spot becomes known as Botcher's Corner. And it was probably the most significant advance Americans had made up until that time. So slowly Americans are beginning to learn the ropes in jungle combat. Reinforcements arrive in December of 1942. The 127th Infantry Regiment is brought up to add some heft to American forces, whereas Japanese forces are now beginning to wear down through casualties, through malaria. The Japanese are unable to bring in significant reinforcements, and that capability diminishes as time goes on. So you start to see things begin to shift towards the Americans. Improving logistics as well. Engineers begin to build port facilities. They begin to build roads, airfields, all of these interconnected. All of this helps to turn the tide towards the Americans. But what really made the difference at Buna was the arrival of Australian tanks. Now, with this new improved logistical system, tanks could come up. These were American-built tanks under Australian command, and on December the 18th of 1942, they attacked across the Duropa plantation. And after a month of measuring their advances in yards, now Allied forces are able to punch through those Japanese bunkers and begin to move, do some open field running, you might say. And now the Japanese, they begin to fall back, not only on the Warren front, but successes on the Warren front in turn open up possibilities on the Urbana front. So in both areas, in the very last weeks of 1942, American forces with Australian tanks and some Australian infantry, they joined this as well, are now able to start really pushing back the Japanese. And Buna Mission finally fell on January the 2nd of 1943. So it had taken several weeks of very hard combat and very hard lessons, but Buna had finally fallen to the Red Arrow Division. Now, General MacArthur had basically declared victory in early January of 1942, but in fact, there was the Sanananda pocket that yet had to be dealt with. This was largely an Australian operation, although Red Arrow Division forces moved in from the east towards the west along the coast. Elements of the 41st American Division were thrown into the battle at this point as well. And by December 22nd of 1942, the battle at Buna was officially declared over, although Japanese continued to resist for weeks afterward. So the Allies at Buna had achieved a victory. The 32nd Division was the first American division to achieve a victory over the Japanese in the Pacific. This should have been a great moment for the Red Arrow Division. But it wasn't. There were many in high places in the Army who were quite critical of the 32nd Division. General MacArthur himself never seems to have gotten over his initial impression of the 32nd Division as a division that had failed at Buna. Now, General Eichelberger, who of course commanded the division at the end of the battle, objected to such characterizations. And here's what Eichelberger wrote in his postwar memoir. A great deal has been said and whispered about the 32nd Division, and much of it makes no sense. The 32nd Division, which failed at Buna, was the same 32nd that won the victory there. No one else did. Now, as for the Red Arrow soldiers themselves, they were very proud of what they had accomplished. Here's what one soldier, James Myers, of the 128th Infantry Regiment said, quote, "We fought the Japanese, we fought the jungle, we fought the rain and mud, the insects, the swamps, diseases, and we won." But the 32nd Division was most certainly exhausted after its grueling battle at Buna, and it basically spent the next year out of action back in Australia. It received a new commander, General William H. Gill, someone who was known as a strict disciplinarian and not always popular with his men, I should point out. Training intensified, now informed by the hard lessons learned at Buna. Replacements begin to come in, replacing those who were lost at Buna through death or disease or malaria. And rotations home began in March of 1944. So you start to see that National Guard character of the 32nd Division give way to a truly nationalized military force with members from all across the country. The 32nd Division participated in General MacArthur's famous leapfrogging across the Pacific. On January the 2nd of 1944, elements of the 32nd Division landed at a place called Sidor on the northern New Guinea coast, where they established an airfield, helped to establish a patrol boat base for the Navy, but were unable to block Japanese soldiers that were retreating through the mountains and jungles in the face of an Australian advance. In April of 1944, Red Arrow soldiers landed at a place called Aitape, about 500 miles farther west on the northern shore of New Guinea. This was largely to seize an airfield. During July of 1945, the Red Arrow Division and other American units, they held off a concerted Japanese counterattack. And they managed to hold on to this airfield and hold their position. The next battle the Red Arrow Division took part in, and the second major battle after Buna was in the Philippines. General MacArthur famously returned in October of 1944. The 32nd Division lands on the island of Leyte in November of 1944, and it begins to fight on the north shore of Leyte at a place called Breakneck Ridge. And I suppose the name tells you a little something about the battle. Here, once again, the Japanese had been able to entrench themselves in the mountains along transportation routes. The 32nd Division relieved the 24th Division and fought a particularly intense battle in Leyte to try to open up a highway and open up a pathway to the port town of Ormoc. So the 32nd Division fought there through November, through December of 1944. In terms of territory taken, the area it had taken was not very great, no more than a couple of miles, although it was extremely important and strategic territory. Here, General MacArthur's grudge against the Red Arrow Division seems to have come to the surface again. He was once again unhappy with the progress of the 32nd Division. Eichelberger recorded in his diary. Well, here's what Eichelberger wrote. Quote, Big Chief stated 32nd had never been any good. Now, again, the territory it took was very important. It basically opened the highway, opened the door to Ormoc. But MacArthur was still unimpressed. Then in January of 1945, the 32nd Division was sent to Luzon, the northern and most important island in the Philippines, and fought a very grueling campaign along a mountain trail known as the Villa Verde Trail. Here again, the story's probably familiar. The Japanese entrenched themselves in a mountain pass, and American soldiers, including the 32nd Division, had to basically root them out. It was a bitter fight for every single hill. The Japanese had dug themselves into caves, mutually reinforcing, and Red Arrow soldiers had to eliminate all of these caves. This was grueling combat that took place over the course of months, mostly from March through May of 1945. And I think when you talk about the battle at the Villa Verde Trail, we must also give credit to the engineers of the 32nd Division, the 114th Engineers, who had to improve this footpath into a roadway capable of carrying trucks and tanks and self-propelled guns and these sorts of things. These engineers did a tremendous job in a very difficult environment, very frequently under fire. And there are stories of bulldozers bulldozing over Japanese bunkers and things like this. So these were combat engineers, and this battle would not have been successful without the engineers building this road to make this battle successful for the Allies. It's finally over by May of 1945. So now in the last months of World War II, the Japanese commander in the Philippines, Yamashita, had basically holed himself up in the mountains of northern Luzon. And the 32nd Division and other American and Filipino units, their task was basically to reduce the holdings of the Japanese. And now by August of 1945, the Japanese are holed up in a small bean-like area in the mountains. And this is where the 32nd Division was when Japan announced its intention to surrender in mid-August of 1945, VJ Day, which was effectively the end of the war, except for the 32nd Division. Some Japanese forces continued to fight on, in part because of their battle ethic, in part because they had not gotten word of the surrender, and of course many couldn't believe it. Finally, Yamashita surrendered to the 32nd Division on September 2nd of 1945, the very day that the war ended. That's when Yamashita turned himself in, and that's when the 32nd Division's war came to an end. That's when the entire war came to an end. And once the war was over, American forces had spoken with Yamashita, and he had a lot to say about which American units he admired. And one that he did admire was the 32nd Division. Here is what Yamashita told General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army. Quote, General Yamashita indicated that he considered the 32nd Division the best his troops encountered both on Leyte and Luzon. So while General MacArthur may not have given the Red Arrow Division its due, the Japanese certainly respected their fighting abilities. Then, after all of that, uh, the 32nd Division was sent on occupation duty in Japan on the island of Kyushu and the very southern tip of Honshu. There, the division was demobilized, and on February 28th of 1946, um, the division finally was demobilized 6 years after it was initially mobilized in 1940. And the toll that the war took on the Red Arrow Division was significant. Here are some figures. Killed in action, more than 1,600. That was the highest number for any U.S. Army division in the Pacific during the war. Battle-related deaths, just a smidge over 2,000. That was second highest of American divisions in the Pacific. 5,600 wounded, that's third highest, and 654 days in combat. That was more time in combat than any Army division in the Second World War. So far as I can tell, more time than any division-sized unit had served in combat during the war. So it had been a very long road for the 32nd Division from World War II, from an inexperienced National Guard division, learning the ways of battle the hard way to become one of the most decorated, most bloodied, and most effective American units in all of World War II. And with that, I thank you all very much for attending.
Hey, thank you, Mark. That really was wonderful. No surprise there, and really great way to wrap up the fall semester. There's already a number of questions in the queue, but I think everyone knows the instructions. Just either type it in the Q&A box at the bottom or raise your hand. Tom asked, how do you account for the lack of training for jungle warfare while in Australia? Surely we had prior knowledge from the Aussies regarding the conditions they would encounter.
Yeah, well, I would say I'd say a few things. First of all, many have blamed General Harding for not really preparing the division as well as he might have. Uh, as I think I noted, the Americans did not have much experience with jungle warfare and did not really have the specialized equipment and things like that it would later. And I would also say that with many American officers, there was a tendency to disregard the Australians, which I think for MacArthur and his staff in particular was really,
Yeah,
frankly, I think quite egregious. I mean, the Australians knew New Guinea certainly better than the Americans did. They had been fighting in the Mediterranean, so you had Australian officers and soldiers who were experienced in combat. But MacArthur was, and many of his staff were quite dismissive of the Australians. So I guess I would briefly, I would cite those three things. There's, what the Americans had experienced, but also and a reluctance to take lessons from the Australians.
yeah. Mike, I see your hands raised. I just want to ask Mark, we got a number of questions about the research you did, Mark, in terms of the diaries and the people you spoke with. Could you briefly talk about that? And then Mike, I'll call on you.
The sources I used for,
Yeah, how you
yeah,
went about doing, because it's somewhat personal, I think, given your background.
yeah. Well, as I noted, I'm a Wisconsin native, so I hope that doesn't come out too much in the presentation. I tried to use a wide variety of resources. Perhaps the backbone, um, for me personally, in my research, I try to focus on the experiences of the typical soldier. I I'm less interested in the high command and the personalities of the generals and all those sorts of things than I am in the ordinary soldier. So whenever possible, I tried to use the memoirs that they had published, the letters that were preserved in archives across the country. Some Red Arrow soldiers had done oral histories. Um, um, and so I tried to utilize those as much as possible. But I did also want to tell the entire story of the division. So I had to look through lots of official records as well. I spent a lot of time in the National Archives in Maryland going over the records of the 32nd Division. So I tried to sort of marry those official sources with the experiences of the ordinary soldier. And I also tried to like put their experiences into the larger historical context as well. So it might get a little nerdy, but in the footnotes, I try to put different battles into contexts or different social situations into context as well.
Very nice. I mean, like I said in my intro, the stories, they really, the individual men, it really came out in the book. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great talk, and thank
Thank
you
you.
for clearing up a lot of things, including um, putting a more realistic edge to um, General MacArthur's reputation, which I think was overrated, to put it mildly. But my question does have to do, well, there's really two questions. One has to do with the intelligence failures on the part on from the U.S. Perspective.
Yeah.
Were those intelligence failures? How high up did it go? I mean, were they the result of MacArthur's staff, including his intelligence officer, who was another problematic character?
Yeah.
Uh, was it due to that, or were there other reasons? And the second question would be, yes, I agree that MacArthur's dismissal and his staff's dismissal of the Australians was almost criminal. But how well did the 32nd, did the division in question, how well did they get along and incorporate themselves with the Australians, including, especially since the ground commander was Australian?
Yeah. Um, well, I'll go to the first question. And if I'm forgetting something about your question, let me know. I was going to point to Colonel, later General Willoughby, who was MacArthur's intelligence chief. I use this quote in the book. Gerhard Weinberg called him perhaps the stupidest intelligence officer of the war. I forgot the exact quote offhand. So, I think he, in particular, consistently underestimated Japanese capabilities and did so throughout the war. And I point this out in the book. I would also say, to be fair to those gathering the intelligence, you're in an environment like New Guinea where you've got this very dense jungle. You're trying to, I don't know, count ships and estimate how many soldiers are on those ships and where the Japanese are storing their stuff and where they're coming from. And you had a lot of inexperience in general in the American military. And it's just hard to keep an eye on your um, adversary um, given those conditions. Now, later on in the war, of course, there was the Ultra program, and basically the Allies were able to read Japanese communications by the end of the war. But that early phase in the war, we hadn't yet broken many of those Japanese codes. And again, given that environment, it was difficult to gain information in the first place. And then the consistent underestimation of the Japanese, which Willoughby did throughout the war. Now, how did the Americans get along with the Australians? The second part of your question, there was a lot of tension at the high command level. MacArthur had basically sidelined Lamy, and during the war, had basically sidelined the Australians into sort of lesser operations, and he really just You know, it was the Americans who invaded the Philippines while the Australians were still fighting in New Guinea, Indonesia, and places like this. So one could argue that MacArthur had basically sidelined the Australians, and there was a lot of tension in the staff. Among the soldiers themselves, from everything I read from the 32nd Division soldiers, they had nothing but admiration for the Australians. In combat, I should say. You know, back in Australia, there were fights about Australian women going out with too many American men, and there was the famous Battle of Brisbane, which happened while the 32nd Division was in New Guinea, but there were fights between American and Australian soldiers. But in New Guinea itself, um, I looked at the American side of this much more than the Australian. I can say that offhand, I can't think of one uh, American soldier in a memoir or an interview or a letter that said bad things about the Australians. They admired the Australians, they admired their toughness, and they admired their experience as well. So it really seemed very different relations on different ends of the chain of command.
Um, yeah, just one other brief follow-up to the intelligence question. Did Willoughby, who was allegedly a bit racist, did he make any move to use indigenous people for intelligence purposes in New Guinea?
Yeah. Well, I don't consider myself to be an expert on that level of the war, and certainly not in intelligence. But what I can say is there were coast watchers throughout the South Pacific, um, who like counted ships going to and from and sent information back. Some were Australian. I'm sure they must have used Papua New Guineans as well. Um, the relationship between the Australians and the Papua New Guineans was complicated, and I try to point this out in the book. This was a colonial relationship, and Australians had a reputation for treating the Papua New Guinean population with harsh discipline. And oftentimes um, the laborers took off. They just disappeared. There are some who worked with the Japanese. Of course, the Japanese were um, noted for their harsh treatment of people in lands that they had invaded as well. Papua New Guineans seem to get along pretty well with Americans. I'm not comfortable commenting on Willoughby's mentality at the time. Um, there's no doubt that the treatment meted out to Papua New Guineans, particularly from Australians, in some cases Americans as well, there's certainly an element of race and racism. There's no question about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. They're great answers for a great talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Gary, I'm fine reading out your question. If you want to unmute your line and ask it, that's fine as well. In the meantime, there's a new question from Anonymous. Mark, did Harding get another command after being relieved from command of the 32nd? Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. General Harding, after he was relieved at Buna, he went back to the States. He was put in charge of defending the Panama Canal.
Mm.
And that was also a training command. So this is where they start to train soldiers for jungle warfare. A few of these trainees in Panama ended up in the 32nd Division. Here again, learning those mistakes from Buna. Then at the end of the war, he was in Washington, and he was put in charge of, if I recall this correctly, I'd have to check this. So don't publish this, but collecting histories of the division. So the Army developed sort of a divisional histories after the war, and MacArthur was put in charge of that. Again, he was a very literary figure. He liked history. He liked Broadway plays and these sorts of things, and so that really suited his talents. Yeah. So Panama and then back to Washington.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to read out Gary's question. This is somewhat of a niche question, but while I can give you a fairly accurate range of tonnages a U.S. division in the ETO would consume in a typical day of combat, I have no idea how much U.S. division fighting in the Pacific jungle would consume. Any information on that with respect to the Red Arrow Division or to U.S. divisions fighting in similar areas would be appreciated. That is definitely a niche
Um,
question. Yeah.
yeah, I don't have those numbers offhand, and I didn't track those sorts of numbers for every single battle. That's beyond what my usual research is. I mean, I do have some figures in the book about, um, I don't recall the exact figures offhand, of how when they got the logistical operations up and running at Buna, I do have some figures about the amount of equipment and tonnage and these sorts of things that was now being brought up by December of 1942 as compared to November of 1942. But I don't have those figures, and that's not something um, I looked into. My book, I approached it as more of a social history of the soldier than a campaign book, although by definition I had to get into the campaigns as well.
Hmm. Mark, excellent presentation. Thank you again. Before we close, just if you're comfortable, would you mind maybe talking about the next project?
Sure. Well, I'm toying with something. I may never get it finished, but I used to work in public history. I used to work in the museum world, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison when I was in graduate school. This was during the 1990s when many World War II veterans were beginning to pass on. I certainly met a large number of these men and many women as well, working in that museum. And I was always interested by the kinds of things that they donated. Or when a veteran died, the family would bring in the soldiers' effects, and they collected souvenirs from all around the world and of many different kinds. Many soldiers had never been very far from their hometowns before. Now they're in London or Paris, and so you might be surprised how many tourist trinkets they picked up while they were on leave or mailed home postcards and things like that. They took lots of photographs. They were very avid photographers, oftentimes. Sometimes they would collect weapons, Allied weapons, enemy weapons in particular, even some rather gruesome things, body parts and things like this. So they collected a lot of different things. So I've written an article about this. I'm trying to develop this into a book about the kinds of things that American GIs collected during World War II and why they collected them.
Hmm. Wow, that sounds fascinating. Um, Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Red Arrow Across the Pacific, the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II by Mark D. Van Ells, and you can see his website address up there. We're going to take a break for a few weeks, but please join us Saturday, January 10th at 1 p.m. when historian James Ellman, and he's spoken to us twice now, will discuss his book, Seeds of Victory, Defeat, Triumph, and the American Way of War, which examines how pivotal American defeats fueled crucial victories through resilience and strategic adaptation. He'll obviously speak on a few World War II battles. Between now and then, I hope everyone has relaxing, restive holidays. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, or however you celebrate. And thank you for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing everyone back in a few weeks. Until then, take care. And Mark, thank you again for your time.
Thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure's ours. Thank you.